Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a completely fascinating shift in modern media and politics. We're going to dissect a recent broadcast of the independent, highly opinionated political podcast called Two Worlds Collide. What we're really looking at here is how raw, unfiltered commentary, literally operating right out of a spare bedroom, is actively challenging and in some cases totally outperforming mainstream political narratives. So, let's jump right in. To make sense of the host's hour-long, really highly emotive monologue, we're going to slice it into 5 clear themes. First up, anti-establishment sentiment. Second, economic and housing grievances. Third, immigration claims. Fourth, green energy versus coal. And finally, the media information war. All right, kicking things off with theme 1, anti-establishment sentiment, and this core belief that quote-unquote losers are running the country. The absolute bedrock of this podcast is a deeply anti-establishment worldview. You really have to notice the specific language used here. The host aggressively uses the term losers to describe politicians across the entire political spectrum. He argues that normal, everyday citizens, people who just want to get on with things, raise a family, and build wealth, have been completely marginalized by an out-of-touch, indoctrinated political class that honestly lacks real-world experience. And to show just how deep he believes this institutional rot actually goes, the host pulls out a pretty wild claim, which he attributes to politician Barnaby Joyce, saying that 75% of government bureaucrats are far-left greenies. In his narrative, it's these unelected officials who are secretly steering the country. They're the ones writing the laws and pushing a specific agenda, literally regardless of which political party is actually sitting in power at the time.
Moving on to theme 2, economic grievances, and what they refer to as the deliberate deleting of the middle class.
During a call-in with a regular guest who goes by Big Chalky, the podcast really taps into a deep-seated economic paranoia. The host enthusiastically agrees with this huge premise that current government policies aren't just clumsy or flawed, but are intentionally designed to widen the wealth gap, crush the middle class, and create a population that relies entirely on the state. He frames the whole thing as a deliberate power grab. It poses a really stark question for the listener. Are you actually being helped, or are you just being managed?
To back this all up, the host points to specific economic levers. He throws some harsh criticism at supposed government attacks on personal investments, specifically targeting things like negative gearing and capital gains taxes on crypto and shares. But he reserves his sharpest warnings for one specific government housing initiative, the 5% home deposit scheme. He views this completely as a financial trap.
Let's actually break down the math on this, exactly as the host presents it, because it really perfectly illustrates his intense anxiety around the housing market. He paints this hypothetical, but honestly very realistic scenario involving a young homebuyer using this exact 5% deposit scheme. Imagine you're trying to buy a completely average $1 million home. You use the scheme, right? So you put down your 50 grand. But as the host calculates it, that leaves you instantly burdened with a staggering, massive debt of $950,000 right out of the gate.
But here's the crucial point. What happens if the market takes a dip? If housing crashes by just 15%, which is a completely plausible scenario, the host warns that these vulnerable buyers will be instantly trapped in negative equity. Basically, your home is now only worth $850,000, yet you are still slaving away to pay off a $950,000 loan. He frames this not as a helping hand from the government at all, but as the perfect setup for a financial catastrophe. And you can see why this message sticks, right? It totally validates the very real financial terror young buyers are feeling right now.
Which brings us to theme 3, immigration claims, and this highly controversial concept of imported labor. The host ties those massive housing anxieties directly into shifting demographics, and the rhetoric here gets incredibly raw. The podcast completely rejects the standard government narrative that record immigration is needed to bring in skilled tradesmen to build more homes. Instead, he argues that the establishment is intentionally importing a new lower class to act as, basically, cogs in a machine, or as his guest bluntly put it, slaves for the wealthy elite. And meanwhile, this massive flood of demand is pricing young, local citizens entirely out of their own housing market. All right, theme 4, green energy versus coal and the argument over virtue signaling.
Taking direct aim at the modern climate agenda, the podcast highlights what it views as just a glaring, massive contradiction. He references an anecdote from comedian Dave Hughes, who, interestingly, the host notes has recently shifted away from his left-leaning views over these exact frustrations. The argument goes like this. How can the country ban or heavily restrict the burning of coal for cheap domestic power, while simultaneously exporting billions of dollars of that exact same coal to be burned in places like Europe, China, and India for profit? I mean, as the host points out, it's literally the exact same atmosphere. To really hammer home his frustration with local green energy mandates, he drops a powerful statistic. Australia contributes roughly 1.2% of global carbon emissions. Because of this tiny fraction, the host frames the whole domestic push for renewables not as some noble quest to save the planet, but as an expensive virtue-signaling scam, one that's driven by green energy billionaires while leaving the average, everyday citizen footing the bill for unreliable power. And finally, Theme 5. The media information war, mainstream versus independent. This all feeds into the grand meta-narrative of the podcast itself, what the host literally calls an ongoing information war. He proudly takes his own solo operation metrics and stacks them right up against the overnight TV ratings of established morning shows. He points out that heavily funded legacy programs like The Today Show pull in roughly 265,000 viewers, and Sunrise hits around 450,000. Meanwhile, his short, independent reels routinely smash past 100,000 downloads in just a few hours. For him, this is absolute proof that the influence of mainstream media is rapidly, visibly fading.
He draws a really sharp David versus Goliath contrast here. On one side, you've got mainstream media, totally bureaucratic, funded by tens of millions of dollars, highly produced, but suffering from heavily declining public trust. And on the flip side, independent media. Raw, unfiltered, operated out of spare bedrooms with an iPhone, but generating this incredibly deep, growing attachment with audiences. He even points out that established, big-name television figures like Karl Stefanovich are migrating over to the podcast space, just to find where the real audiences have gone.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the massive shift happening right in front of us. Millions of everyday citizens are actively tuning out polished corporate broadcasts and leaning into the raw intensity, the unapologetic bias, and the deeply personal connection of independent commentators. So the big question we have to leave you with today is this. If the future of the public square is officially moving out of the shiny television studio and into the unfiltered backroom, how is that going to reshape the future of our political reality? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning what you hear.